Do you ever wonder if we're all just playing roles, sticking to scripts we never wrote? The question hung in the air, heavier than the scent of rain from the storm brewing outside. I looked up from my phone, startled. Garrett, my stepdad, leaned against the kitchen counter, swirling the last of his coffee, his eyes sharp and thoughtful, fixed on me like he was expecting an answer. I cleared my throat. I guess, yeah, sometimes. My voice felt too small for the moment, but his question rattled something loose inside me. Garrett had always been like that, a man who seemed to see things others didn't. He married my mom when I was 16, and I'd always admired his quiet confidence, the way he carried himself like he belonged wherever he was. Over time, though, I realized he wasn't just self-assured. He was magnetic. People gravitated toward him, and I wasn't immune to it either. Now, at 23, I'd moved back home after college to save some money. Living under the same roof as my mom and Garrett wasn't ideal, but it felt safe, a temporary solution until I got my footing. Except lately, safe wasn't the word I'd used to describe being around him. "Your mom will be gone this weekend," he said, his tone casual. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze never wavering. "Conference in Portland." "I know," I replied, trying to sound unaffected. Mom had mentioned it at dinner earlier in the week. She's been talking about it nonstop. She's excited. "Big opportunity for her," he said, smiling. His teeth caught the light, perfect and sharp, and I found myself looking away too quickly. The room felt smaller when it was just the two of us. I couldn't pinpoint when I started noticing it, but there was an electricity to these moments, a quiet hum beneath the surface of our exchanges. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't deny it either. "You got plans while she's gone?" he asked, setting his empty mug in the sink. "Not really," I shrugged. "Probably just work on some applications, maybe go for a run." He nodded, his lips curling into a knowing smirk. "Good. Stay out of trouble." I laughed, though it came out forced. "Yeah, because trouble's my middle name." Garrett chuckled, the sound deep and warm, like it came from somewhere genuine. "You'd surprise yourself." With that, he pushed off the counter and disappeared down the hall. The storm outside had started in earnest now, rain tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. I stared at the empty mug he'd left behind, my mind spinning. There was something in the way he spoke to me, something layered, like every word carried a weight I wasn't sure how to unpack. That evening, I sat in the living room scrolling aimlessly through my phone, trying to drown out the storm and my restless thoughts. Garrett walked in, barefoot and relaxed, wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked at ease, like the kind of man who belonged wherever he chose to be. "You want to watch something?" he asked, gesturing toward the TV. "Sure," I said, surprised. We didn't do this. Hang out. Just the two of us. It felt strange, but I couldn't find a reason to say no. He settled on the couch next to me, closer than I'd expected. He flipped through channels before landing on some crime thriller. The plot unfolded, full of twists and turns, but my focus wavered. Every time Garrett shifted or leaned forward to grab his drink, I became hyper-aware of his presence. "This guy's an idiot," he said, pointing to the screen. "Never leave fingerprints at the scene." I laughed nervously. "You say that like you've done this before." He smirked, his eyes flicking to mine. "Maybe I have. Maybe I haven't." The banter felt natural, easy even, but underneath it was a current I couldn't ignore. By the time the credits rolled, I was tense, not from the movie but from how comfortable it had felt being here with him. As he stood to stretch, his shirt lifted slightly, revealing a glimpse of his stomach. I caught myself looking and quickly averted my gaze, but not before his eyes landed on me. He didn't say anything, just offered a faint smile before heading toward the stairs. "Don't stay up too late," he said over his shoulder. "I won't." The lights dimmed as he disappeared, leaving me alone with the storm outside and the storm brewing inside me. Something had shifted tonight, something I couldn't ignore. and the weekend had only just begun. Couldn't sleep. Garrett's voice startled me. I turned to see him, standing at the edge of the dimly lit kitchen, his broad frame leaning casually against the doorframe. I shook my head, clutching the glass of water I'd come downstairs for. No, just restless, I guess. He nodded, stepping closer. His gray t-shirt clung to him in a way that highlighted his toned physique. "It's the storm," he said, his voice low and calm. "Always messes with my sleep too." The rain outside was relentless, slamming against the windows with a fury that mirrored the tension building between us. I placed the glass on the counter, my fingers lingering on its rim as Garrett moved closer. "You seemed quiet earlier," he said, his eyes catching mine in the faint glow of the kitchen light. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied. The truth was, I wasn't fine. My thoughts had been a mess since dinner, tangled up in his words, his smile, the subtle glances that seemed to linger just a little too long. "You sure?" His voice softened, almost gentle, as he stepped closer. "You don't seem fine." There was a weight in his gaze that made it hard to breathe. I forced a laugh, trying to break the tension. "Maybe I just need to get out more." Garrett smirked, leaning one hand on the counter beside me. His proximity sent a jolt through me. "Or maybe," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you're thinking too much." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. His words hung in the air, heavy and suggestive, and I could feel the pull of something I didn't fully understand. "Garrett, I started, but the words caught in my throat as his hand brushed against mine. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his tone steady, almost reassuring. His hand lingered, warm against my skin. "I can see it in your eyes." I looked up at him, my breath hitching. The intensity in his gaze was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, unwavering, unapologetic. My mind screamed that this was wrong, that I should step away, but my body refused to move. "Garrett," I tried again, but he silenced me with a soft, deliberate touch, a hand gently cupping my cheek. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The storm outside faded into a distant roar as his thumb traced a slow, deliberate path along my jawline. His touch was careful, almost reverent, as if he were testing the boundaries of what I would allow. I didn't pull away. The space between us disappeared in an instant. His lips met mine with a tentative urgency, and the world tilted on its axis. His kiss was unlike anything I'd experienced, firm yet tender, commanding yet careful. My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding, but none loud enough to stop what was happening. His hand slid from my cheek to the back of my neck, pulling me closer. The kitchen counter pressed against my back as he leaned into me, his presence overwhelming in the best way. I felt my own hands move, tentative at first, until they found their way to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my fingertips. We broke apart for a breath, and his forehead rested against mine. His eyes, dark and searching, locked onto mine, as if asking a silent question. "This," I began, my voice shaky. "This can't happen." His lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "Maybe not," he said, his voice low and rough. But it already did. His words hit me like a thunderclap, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The weight of what we'd just done settled over me, heavy and suffocating. Garrett stepped back, his hand sliding down my arm before dropping away entirely. "Go get some sleep," he said, his voice softer now, almost regretful. "We'll talk tomorrow." I stood frozen as he walked away, his silhouette disappearing up the stairs. The kitchen felt colder without him there, the storm outside roaring louder than before. I pressed my hands against the counter, my heart still racing. What had I done? What had we done? As I stared into the empty kitchen, one thought consumed me. There was no going back now. The morning light poured through the curtains, cutting across my room in sharp, unforgiving streaks. Sleep had evaded me entirely, replaced by a relentless replay of the night before. Garrett's words, his touch, the intensity of his gaze, they clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I sat on the edge of my bed, head in my hands, trying to make sense of it all. What had I done? What had he done? My mind offered no answers, only a barrage of guilt, confusion, and something darker, something I was too afraid to name. The house was silent when I finally stepped into the hallway. Mom wouldn't be back until later that evening, and Garrett was nowhere in sight. Part of me was relieved, grateful for the chance to gather my thoughts without the weight of his presence. But another part of me, a part one hated, was desperate to see him, to find some kind of resolution or reassurance. I found him in the backyard, crouched by the garden bed, pulling weeds with a quiet focus. He didn't look up when I approached, but I knew he sensed me there. "Morning," he said finally, his voice even, almost casual. "Morning," I replied, my throat dry. An awkward silence stretched between us, the kind that begged to be filled, but resisted any attempt to break it. "About last night," I started, my voice trembling. He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans before turning to face me. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes steady as they met mine. "I'm not going to make excuses," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "What happened it shouldn't have. You know that as much as I do." I nodded, my chest tightening. "Then why did it?" Garrett sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because sometimes, in the moment, things feel inevitable. Like no matter how wrong they are, you can't stop yourself." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, because they mirrored exactly how I'd felt. Last night hadn't been about logic or morality. It had been about raw, unfiltered emotion. "But it doesn't change anything," he continued, his voice softening. "It doesn't change what's right, and it doesn't change the fact that your mom," he stopped, his jaw tightening, "doesn't deserve this." I finished for him. He nodded, his eyes dropping to the ground. "Exactly." The guilt was like a weight pressing down on my chest, but there was something else too, something harder to define. A part of me couldn't let go of what had happened, couldn't dismiss it as a simple mistake. It had felt too real, too powerful. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Garrett looked at me, his gaze steady but heavy with regret. "We move on. We pretend it never happened." The finality in his tone was like a slap, and I nodded slowly, even as my heart screamed in protest. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Garrett kept his distance, busying himself with small tasks around the house. I tried to distract myself, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt his touch, heard his words. By the time Mom returned that evening, the weight of the secret we now shared felt unbearable. She greeted me with a warm hug, oblivious to the storm raging beneath the surface. "How was your weekend?" she asked, her smile bright and genuine. "Uneventful," I lied, forcing a smile. Garrett appeared behind her, his expression carefully neutral. He kissed her on the cheek and asked about her trip, slipping effortlessly back into his role as the devoted husband. Watching them together felt like a knife twisting in my gut. That night, I lay awake in the dark, my thoughts racing. I couldn't help but wonder if Garrett felt the same turmoil I did, or if he'd already compartmentalized the whole thing, filed it away as a mistake to be forgotten. The truth was, I didn't know what this meant for me, for us. Would the memory of that night fade with time, or would it linger, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed? This wasn't a love story. It wasn't even a romance. It was a story about choices, about consequences, about the fragile boundaries we build around ourselves and what happens when those boundaries shatter. For anyone watching this, I don't expect sympathy or judgment, only understanding. Stories like these aren't about justification. They're about truth. And the truth is, sometimes, the lines between right and wrong blur in ways we never anticipate. The real question is, what would you have done?